I was never the type of person to get scared easily. I liked being alone. I liked the quiet. So when I rented a cabin deep in the woods for a week of solitude, I wasn't thinking about fear. I was thinking about getting away from everything: work, my phone, people. Just me and nature. The drive out was long. The cabin was about 30 miles from the nearest town, tucked deep in the woods with no neighbors in sight. The road turned from pavement to gravel, then to dirt, winding through thick trees that made the evening sky darker than it should have been. By the time I arrived, the sun was low, casting long shadows across the clearing where the cabin sat. It was old but sturdy, a single-story structure with a small porch, a stone chimney, and thick wooden walls. There was a shed off to the side, locked with a rusted padlock, and a pile of chopped wood stacked neatly near the porch. The place looked abandoned, but I had been assured it was maintained well enough for guests. Inside, the air was stale. The living room had a stone fireplace with a stack of dry logs beside it. A couch, an old wooden rocking chair, and a coffee table sat in the center. The kitchen was small but functional. An old gas stove, a fridge that hummed loudly, and wooden cabinets filled with mismatched dishes. The bedroom had a bed with a heavy quilt, a small dresser, and a single window looking out into the trees.
No TV, no Wi-Fi.
Just the way I wanted it. I spent the first night reading by lantern light. The wind outside made the trees creak and groan, and every so often, I'd hear something rustling in the underbrush, probably animals. I kept a fire going in the fireplace, its warmth comforting against the chill creeping in from the woods. It wasn't until the second night that things started to feel off. I woke up around 2 a.m., not to a noise but to a feeling, the kind that raises the hairs on the back of your neck. The room was pitch black. I reached for my lantern, but before I could light it, I heard something outside. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, not the scurrying of an animal. Something heavier. I held my breath, listening. The footsteps moved around the cabin, crunching over dead leaves. I waited for them to pass, to fade into the distance. But they didn't. They stopped right outside my window. I lay frozen, heart hammering, afraid to move. The walls of the cabin were thick, but the window had no curtains, no blinds. Just glass separating me from whatever was out there. Minutes passed, then a soft tap. Not a knock, just the lightest touch against the glass. Couldn't breathe. I didn't dare turn my head. Didn't want to see whatever was there. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the tapping stopped. The footsteps moved again, slower this time, dragging. And then silence. I stayed awake until dawn, my ears straining for any sound, but there was nothing. When the sun finally rose, I forced myself out of bed and stepped outside. The ground was damp from the night air. I circled the cabin, looking for footprints, for any sign that someone had been there. But the ground was undisturbed, the leaves still scattered as they had been the day before. I told myself it was my imagination. Maybe I had dreamed it. Maybe the wind had knocked a branch against the window. I tried to shake it off, but all day, an uneasiness clung to me. The feeling of being watched never went away. That night, I locked the door, double-checked the windows, and kept my lantern close. Sleep didn't come easily, but eventually exhaustion won. Sometime in the night, I woke up again. This time I heard breathing, not mine. It was deep, slow, just outside the cabin walls. My body went rigid. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. It was something standing right outside, exhaling slow, deliberate breaths. I reached for the lantern and lit it, the small flame flickering against the darkness. The breathing stopped. I sat up, listening. The only sound was my own heartbeat, pounding in my ears. I stayed awake the rest of the night. Morning came and I was done pretending. I packed my things, threw them into my truck, and got ready to leave. but my tires were slashed. All four of them. Panic surged through me. I was alone, deep in the woods with no cell service and no way to leave. I checked the cabin again, searching for a landline, a radio, anything. Nothing. I grabbed my hatchet from my bag and stepped outside. Whoever had done this had to still be around. They had to be watching me. I stood there, scanning the trees, waiting. But the woods were silent. Too silent.
No birds.
No wind. Just stillness. I had two choices: wait for help or start walking. The nearest town was miles away, but if I stuck to the road, I could make it by nightfall. I grabbed my backpack, stuffed it with essentials, and started walking. The road stretched endlessly between the trees. Every now and then, I glanced over my shoulder, but I saw nothing. But I felt it. Something was following me. Couldn't see it, couldn't hear it, but I knew it was there. The feeling never left. I quickened my pace, my boots crunching against the gravel, the sound too loud in the silence. The road twisted through the trees, and for hours I walked. My legs burned, my throat dry, but I kept moving. Then, in the distance, I saw it, headlights, a truck. Relief flooded me. I ran toward it, waving my arms. The truck slowed, and an older man leaned out. "You all right?" he asked. I nodded, breathless. "My truck. Tires slashed. Cabin." He looked past me, down the road, then back at me. His expression darkened. "Get in." I didn't hesitate. I climbed into the passenger seat, locking the door behind me. As we drove, I told him everything. He listened, his hands tight on the wheel. When I finished, he let out a slow breath. "You ain't the first," he said finally. "Won't be the last." I stared at him. "What do you mean?" He didn't answer right away, just kept driving, eyes on the road. Finally, he said, "That cabin's been empty a long time. People stay there. Some leave, some don't." I didn't ask anything else. I didn't want to know. I never went back for my truck. Never even went back to that town. Some places you just don't go back to. I don't know why I agreed to watch my uncle's cabin. Maybe it was the promise of quiet, a break from the city, or just the simple fact that I owed him a favor. Either way, I found myself driving 2 hours into the woods, heading toward a place I had only been to once as a kid. The road twisted through thick trees, the sky disappearing behind the towering pines. It was early fall, the leaves turning red and gold, but there was something about the way the wind pushed through them that unsettled me. I chalked it up to nerves. When I pulled up to the cabin, the place looked exactly how I remembered it. Small, made of dark wood, and slightly leaning to one side like it had been fighting against time and losing. There was a porch with a single rocking chair, and to the right of the house, an old shed that looked like it hadn't been opened in years. The key was under a loose board on the porch, just like my uncle had said. I unlocked the door, stepping inside. The cabin smelled like dust, wood, and something faintly metallic. The furniture was old and mismatched. A fireplace sat in the center of the main room, with a few logs stacked neatly beside it. There was no TV, no internet, just an old radio sitting on a wooden table near the kitchen. The windows were small, letting in just enough light to make the inside feel dim even during the day. I spent the first couple of hours settling in, unpacking the food I brought, making sure the generator was working, and checking the locks on the doors and windows. My uncle had warned me that animals sometimes got too curious. That first night was quiet, too quiet. In the city, there's always noise, cars, sirens, people. Out here, it was just the wind, the creaking of the trees, and the occasional sound of something moving through the underbrush. I told myself it was a deer or a raccoon, but something about it felt off. The next morning, I found footprints in the dirt near the porch. They weren't from an animal. They were human, barefoot, The prints were small, like a child's, but they weren't fresh. They were faint, like they had been made a few days ago, but still clear enough that I could make out the shape of toes, the curve of the heel. I told myself they had to be old. Someone else must have come up here recently. Maybe a hiker. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I spent the day chopping wood, walking around the cabin's perimeter, trying to enjoy the silence. But every now and then, I got the feeling that someone was watching me. That night, I locked the doors and windows tight. I kept a fire burning in the fireplace and stayed up reading a book I found on the shelf. At some point, I must have fallen asleep because I woke up to a noise. It was soft, barely noticeable over the crackling fire. A shuffling sound just outside the front door. I sat up, heart pounding, listening. Then 3 soft knocks. Not loud, not urgent, just 3 light taps on the wood. I stayed still, barely breathing. I didn't move. Another 3 knocks. I wanted to believe it was my uncle. Maybe he had changed his mind and come to check on the cabin. But my uncle wouldn't knock like that. He would have called out, made his presence known. I reached for the rifle my uncle kept above the fireplace. My hands were slick with sweat as I held it. I didn't know what I was expecting, but I didn't move. I just sat there, staring at the door. The knock stopped. The next morning, I found more footprints near the porch. The same small, barefoot ones. But this time, there were more of them. A lot more. They circled the cabin, leading into the woods. I followed them for a few yards before they just stopped. No sign of where they went. No broken branches, no disturbed leaves. Just gone. I wanted to leave. Every part of me told me to get in my car and go. But I had promised my uncle I'd stay the week. The 3rd night, I barricaded the door with a chair. I sat in front of the fireplace, rifle in my lap. I kept every light on. Around midnight, the knocking started again. 3 soft taps, then silence, then another 3. I didn't move. I just gripped the rifle tighter. Then, something even worse happened. The doorknob turned. Slowly, deliberately, I raised the rifle, aiming at the door, but my hands were shaking so badly I wasn't sure I could pull the trigger if I had to. The knob twisted again. The door creaked slightly as it pushed inward against the chair. Then suddenly it stopped. Silence. I sat there for hours, not moving, waiting for the sun to rise. When it did, I went outside, rifle still in hand. The footprints were everywhere now, all around the cabin, leading to the shed. I had never opened the shed. My uncle never told me what was in there. My heart was racing as I walked toward it. The door was slightly ajar, the old rusted lock hanging open. I took a deep breath, pushed it open, and looked inside. The air inside was stale, damp, and something about it made my stomach turn. There was a single wooden chair in the center of the room. Chains hung from the walls, rusted, old, dried, dark stains beneath them. I stepped back, nearly tripping over something half buried in the dirt. I looked down and saw it, a small human jawbone. I left that morning, didn't even pack my things. I got in my car and drove as fast as I could, not stopping until I was back in the city. I called my uncle. He didn't answer. A few days later, I heard that he had died. No one could tell me exactly how. I never went back to that cabin, never tried to find out more. I don't want to know. I had driven out to the cabin early that morning, a 2-hour trip through winding back roads and long stretches of nothing. My uncle had left it to me in his will, along with a note saying it might need some repairs but was still standing strong. He always spent his summers out here, fishing, hunting, and living off the land. I hadn't been to the cabin since I was a kid, but I remembered it well. Old, quiet, tucked deep in the woods where no one could bother you. The plan was simple. Get in, check out the place, make a list of what needed fixing, and head back before dark. But plans don't always work out the way you expect. The drive was uneventful, but as I turned onto the last dirt road leading up to the property, something felt off. The trees here were taller than I remembered, thick and close together, blocking out most of the sky. I rolled down my window, expecting to hear birds or maybe the rustling of squirrels in the underbrush. But there was nothing, just the sound of my tires crunching on gravel and my own breathing. I pulled up to the cabin, shut off the engine, and stepped out. The place looked exactly the same, log walls dark with age, a sagging porch, and a stone chimney that had probably seen 100 winters. The door was locked, just like my uncle had left it. I had the key, but before I used it, I walked around the cabin, checking the windows, the roof, and the foundation. It was solid, just weathered. When I stepped inside, a stale, musty smell filled my nose. Dust covered everything. Sunlight streamed through the grimy windows, casting long shadows on the wooden floor. The furniture was still there, old chairs, a table, a sagging couch. My uncle's hunting gear was piled in the corner, untouched. I spent the next couple of hours making notes. The roof needed patching, the front steps were rotting, and the wood stove had rusted over. I swept away cobwebs, opened windows to let in fresh air, and checked the generator in the back shed. It was dead. No surprise there. By the time I finished, the sun was already dipping behind the trees. I had lost track of time. I cursed under my breath, grabbed my keys, and headed for the truck. That's when I noticed something strange. There were footprints in the dirt. Not mine, not old. They led from the tree line to the side of the cabin, stopping just below one of the windows. The prints were deep, like whoever made them had been standing there for a while. Watching, I stood frozen, my heart pounding. The woods were still silent. No wind, no birds, just the heavy, pressing quiet. I looked around, scanning the trees, the shadows, the long stretch of empty road. No one. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe a hunter passing through, maybe an animal, but my gut said otherwise. Still, I wasn't about to panic over some footprints. I forced myself to act normal, got in the truck, and turned the key. Nothing. The engine didn't even try to turn over. Just silence. I checked everything, the battery, the fuel line, the fuses. Everything looked fine, but the truck was dead. I stood there for a long time, staring at it, trying to ignore the creeping unease crawling up my spine. The cabin had a radio, but it only worked when the generator was running. My phone had no signal. I could walk, but the nearest town was nearly 20 miles away, and the idea of hiking through the woods in the dark didn't sit right with me. I didn't have much of a choice. I grabbed my flashlight, locked the truck, and started walking. The road was narrow, just dirt and gravel winding through the trees. The last bit of daylight faded fast, and soon, the only light came from my flashlight and the pale glow of the moon filtering through the branches. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Not mine. They were slow, deliberate, coming from somewhere behind me. I stopped. So did they. I turned, shining my flashlight into the trees. Nothing but shadows and branches swaying in the night breeze. I waited, listening. Silence. I walked faster. The sound came again. Closer. I ran. I don't remember how far or how long I ran, but by the time I stopped, my chest was burning. My legs felt like lead, and my flashlight was shaking in my hands. I turned, gasping for breath, scanning the darkness behind me. Nothing, just the woods, just silence. I took a deep breath and started moving again. Slower this time, more careful. I kept my flashlight low, sweeping it across the ground, watching for movement. The road stretched on, endless. I felt exposed, vulnerable, like something was watching me, just beyond the trees. Then I saw it, a figure standing in the road ahead. tall, motionless, just a dark shape against the night. I froze. My heart slammed against my ribs. My flashlight trembled as I raised it, the beam catching the edges of a jacket, a face, eyes that reflected the light like an animal's. I turned and ran. I didn't stop until I saw the cabin again, its shape looming in the darkness. I fumbled with the key, threw the door open, and locked it behind me. My breath came in ragged gasps. My whole body was shaking. I pressed my ear to the door, listening. Silence. Then a single, deliberate knock. I backed away. Another knock. Slow, steady. I didn't move, didn't breathe, just stared at the door, at the thin strip of darkness beneath it. The knock came again. Then the doorknob turned. I grabbed my uncle's old rifle from the corner, cocked it, aimed at the door. My hands were sweaty, shaking. The knob stopped turning. The knocking stopped. The silence stretched on, thick and heavy. I stood there for what felt like hours, my eyes never leaving the door. Eventually, the first light of morning crept through the windows. The night was over. I never heard the footsteps leave. I didn't want to be out here. That was the first thing I knew for sure as I turned off the highway onto the narrow dirt road leading to the cabin. The road was rutted and uneven, covered in fallen leaves and loose gravel. My truck's tires kicked up dust as I eased forward, my fingers tight on the wheel. I glanced at the GPS on my phone, no service. Typical. I had downloaded the map ahead of time, but the little blue dot was lagging behind, jumping every few seconds like it couldn't keep up with me. The cabin belonged to my uncle. He had owned it for years but rarely used it. He had offered it to me for the weekend, insisting I could use some time away from everything. I didn't argue. I was in between jobs, and my lease was ending soon. I had been crashing at a buddy's place, but I could tell I was overstaying my welcome. The cabin was remote, quiet, a good place to clear my head, at least in theory. I pulled up in front of the cabin just as the sun was dipping behind the trees. It was a squat, single-story building with a sagging front porch and a metal roof. The wood was dark from years of rain and neglect, the windows smudged and dull. A small shed sat off to the side, its door slightly ajar. I made a mental note to check it later. I shut off the truck and climbed out, stretching my legs. The air was cool, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine. No sounds except the rustling of the wind through the trees. No birds, no insects. That was strange. The cabin's door was unlocked, just as my uncle had promised. I pushed it open, stepping inside. The place smelled stale, like old wood and dust. The furniture was basic, a sagging couch, a wooden table with 2 chairs, a small kitchen with outdated appliances. There was a fireplace, but the woodpile next to it was low. I'd have to chop more if I wanted to keep warm. I flicked the light switch. Nothing. The power was supposed to work, but this deep in the woods, I wasn't surprised if something had knocked out a line. I pulled out my flashlight and shined it around. The bedroom was small, just a bed and a dresser. The bathroom had running water, at least. I dropped my bag on the couch inside. First things first, I needed firewood. I grabbed the old axe from the shed and set to work, the rhythmic thunk of the blade cutting through the silence. It took longer than I expected, but I managed to split enough wood to last the night. By the time I got a fire going, it was fully dark. The forest outside was a wall of black, the trees barely visible against the night sky. I locked the door, bolted it for good measure, and settled onto the couch with a can of chili I had heated over the fire. It was quiet, too quiet. Then I heard it, a noise outside, a soft crunch, like a footstep on dry leaves. I froze, my spoon halfway to my mouth. I waited, listening. Nothing, probably an animal. I forced myself to relax and finished my food. I told myself I was being paranoid, but I still checked the lock on the door before heading to bed. I woke up suddenly. No reason, just that instinctive jolt awake, like my body knew something wasn't right. The fire had burned down to embers, casting flickering shadows on the walls. And then I heard it again. Footsteps outside. Slow, deliberate, not an animal. I stayed still, barely breathing. My heart pounded in my ears. The footsteps circled the cabin, crunching through the leaves. Whoever it was, they weren't trying to be quiet. I reached for my phone, but there was still no signal. I cursed under my breath. I had a hunting knife in my bag, but that was it. My uncle had told me there was an old rifle somewhere, but I hadn't bothered to look for it. The footsteps stopped near the front porch. A long pause. Then the doorknob rattled. My blood turned to ice. I grabbed my knife and moved as quietly as I could to the window, peeking out. I could barely see anything in the darkness, just the vague outline of a figure standing by the door. They didn't knock. They just stood there. I gripped the knife tighter, my breath shallow. I didn't know what to do. I could stay inside, wait them out, or I could try to scare them off. My uncle had an air horn in the shed. I had seen it earlier. If I could get to it, before I could move, the figure stepped back from the door and walked off the porch. The footsteps faded into the woods. I stayed up the rest of the night, knife in hand, listening. Morning came slow. The first light of dawn crept through the windows, chasing away the worst of my fear. I cautiously opened the door, stepping onto the porch. The ground was covered in disturbed leaves, footprints leading from the woods to my door. But there was something else. On the porch, just by the door, was a single hunting knife. Old, rusted, the handle worn smooth. It hadn't been there before. Someone had left it. A warning, or an invitation. I didn't wait to find out which. I grabbed my things, threw them into the truck, and drove away without looking back. I never told my uncle what happened. Never went back to that cabin. Some places aren't meant to be alone in, and some people don't need ghosts to be terrifying. The drive up to the cabin felt longer than it should have. The winding roads were narrow, the kind that made you slow down at every turn, even though there wasn't another car in sight. The trees on either side stood tall and lifeless, bare from the late fall cold, their branches reaching out like thin arms. The sky had that dull, gray look, like it couldn't decide if it wanted to rain or snow. I glanced at the GPS, but there was no signal. That didn't matter much, though. I had printed the directions before I left. The cabin was an old family property, one I hadn't been to in years. It sat deep in the woods, away from everything, just the way I wanted it.
No negurs, no noise, no distractions.
Just time to think. Work had been eating at me lately, and I needed a break. The kind of break where you just sit in silence and let the world fade away. I figured a weekend in isolation would do the trick. When I finally pulled up, the place looked exactly how I remembered it. A one-story wooden structure with a small porch, the paint peeling off the railing. The windows were dirty, the kind of dirty that happens when a place is left alone for too long. The front door stuck a little when I pushed it open, and the smell of dust and old would hit me right away. I stood there for a moment, taking it in. It felt colder inside than it was outside. I dropped my bag in the living room and took a look around. The furniture was covered in sheets, but everything was still where it had always been. The fireplace stood against the far wall, the stone darkened from years of use. I pulled the sheets off the couch and the old rocking chair in the corner, stirring up a cloud of dust that made me cough. The first thing I did was check the power. There was none, which I expected. The place ran on a generator, and I had to turn it on manually. I stepped back outside and walked around to the shed. The padlock was rusted but still intact. I fumbled with the key for a second before getting it open. The generator sat inside, looking just as old as I remembered, but it only took a couple of tries before it roared to life. The lights inside flickered for a second, then held steady. I went back in and set up for the night, threw some logs into the fireplace, lit a match, and watched the flames grow. The heat started spreading, making the place feel less empty. I heated up some canned soup over the fire, ate straight from the pot, then sat back and listened to the silence. It was too quiet. I had forgotten how deep the silence could be out here. No cars, no distant hum of traffic, no voices. Just the occasional creak of the wood as it settled. I tried to push the feeling away, but something about it put me on edge. I checked the locks on the doors and windows before heading to bed. The mattress was stiff, the blankets musty, but I was too tired to care. Sometime in the night, I woke up. I wasn't sure why at first. Then I heard it. A sound, faint but there. A slow, dragging sound outside, like something heavy moving across the ground. I lay still, holding my breath. It was probably an animal, I told myself. A deer, maybe. A raccoon. Something small. I listened for a while longer, but the sound didn't come back. After a few minutes, I rolled over and tried to go back to sleep. The next morning, I stepped outside to get some air. The cold bit at my skin. The sky was even duller than the day before. I walked around the cabin, stretching my legs. That's when I saw it. Tracks in the dirt. Not animal tracks. Footprints. They circled the cabin once, then disappeared into the woods. I stared at them for a long time, my brain trying to find a logical explanation. Maybe some hiker had wandered through, but that didn't make sense. The cabin was miles from any trail, and the footprints were fresh. Too fresh. Someone had been here while I was sleeping. I went back inside and locked the door. The rest of the day, I tried to shake the unease. I kept the fire going, made myself food, read a book I had brought along. But I couldn't stop checking the windows, couldn't stop listening. That night, I made sure everything was locked up tight. I even moved the couch in front of the door just in case. Then I lay in bed, waiting. It was sometime past midnight when I heard it again. The same dragging sound, closer this time, then a soft thud against the wall. I sat up, my heart pounding. Another thud, then another, like someone was pressing their hands against the cabin, testing it. I reached for my flashlight and held it tight, waiting, then silence. I don't know how long I stayed like that, but eventually, I must have fallen asleep because I woke up to sunlight streaming through the window. I checked outside again. More footprints, more than before, and something else. A carving in the wooden porch railing. A small, shallow mark. At first, I thought it was just random scratches, but when I looked closer, I saw it was a symbol, a circle with a line through it. That was enough for me. I packed my things in less than 5 minutes. Threw my bag in the car, turned on the engine, and didn't look back. I didn't stop until I was miles away, back on the main road, back where my phone had signal. Later, I looked up the symbol, trying to find out what it meant. There were a few different explanations. Some said it was an old marking used by people to claim abandoned places. Others said it was a warning. Either way, I never went back to that cabin. And I don't plan to. I don't know why I agreed to stay at that cabin. Maybe I just wanted some time alone, away from the noise of the city. Maybe I thought it would be peaceful, a way to clear my mind. But if I had known what would happen, I never would have gone. The cabin belonged to a friend of a friend. It was deep in the woods, far from town, with no neighbors for miles. When I arrived, the air was thick with the smell of damp wood and pine. The trees stretched high into the sky, their bare branches twisting in the wind. It was late autumn, and the air had a bite to it, crisp and cold. I parked my truck near the small clearing in front of the cabin, grabbed my bags, and walked up the creaky wooden steps. The key was under a loose brick beside the porch, just like my friend had told me. The lock clicked open, and I stepped inside. The cabin was small, just one main room with a kitchen against the far wall, a worn-out couch near the fireplace, and a small wooden table with 2 chairs. A single door led to the bedroom, and beyond that, a tiny bathroom. It wasn't much, but it was enough. I set my bags down and started unpacking. The silence was heavy, the kind that makes your ears ring. I hadn't realized how used to noise I was until I stood there, listening to nothing but my own breathing. Even outside, there was barely any sound, just the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. As I settled in, I noticed how cold it was inside. The fireplace was empty, so I went outside to grab some firewood from the small pile stacked against the cabin. The logs were damp, but I managed to find a few dry enough to burn. I got a fire going and sat down on the couch, watching the flames crackle. That first night, I slept lightly. Every sound woke me up. The creak of the wooden walls, the wind against the windows, the distant snap of a branch breaking. At some point, I thought I heard something moving outside, slow, deliberate steps crunching the leaves just beyond the cabin. But when I sat up and listened, there was nothing, just the wind. The next day, I went for a walk, following a narrow path that led deeper into the woods. The air was sharp, and my breath hung in front of me in small clouds. I found a stream about a mile in, the water running clear and cold. I knelt down, dipped my hands in, and let the chill sink into my bones. Felt good, grounding. I stayed there for a while, just listening to the water and the wind through the trees. When I got back to the cabin, something felt off. The door was closed just like I'd left it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I stepped inside and looked around. Nothing seemed out of place. My bags were still where I'd left them. The fire had burned out, and the air was colder than before. But that feeling wouldn't leave. That night, I locked the door and wedged a chair under the handle. I didn't know why. Maybe it was just paranoia. Maybe I was being stupid. But I couldn't ignore the unease settling in my chest. I woke up sometime after midnight, heart pounding. The fire had died, and the cabin was pitch black. The only sound was the wind outside. Then, I heard its soft footsteps, moving slowly around the cabin. Not an animal. Too steady, too human. I held my breath, listening. The footsteps stopped near the porch, then a soft scrape against the wood. A shadow moved outside the window, barely visible in the dark. My blood went cold. I stayed completely still, barely breathing. Minutes passed, maybe longer. Then, the footsteps moved away, fading into the trees. I didn't sleep after that. I sat in bed, gripping the blanket, waiting for morning. To first light, I packed my bags. I didn't care if it was just my imagination. I wasn't staying another night. But when I stepped outside, I saw them. Footprints in the dirt, circling the cabin. I don't know how long someone had been out there. I don't know why they didn't try to get in. But I wasn't going to wait to find out. I threw my bags in the truck, started the engine, and drove away without looking back. I never told my friend what happened. I never asked about the cabin or who had stayed there before me. I just know I won't be going back. I never should have agreed to watch the cabin. It seemed simple enough at the time. A friend of a friend needed someone to keep an eye on their remote place for a couple of weeks, and I needed a break from the city. It was supposed to be quiet, peaceful, a chance to unplug. No neighbors, no distractions, just the thick woods and a lake a few miles away. I figured I could read, hike, maybe even get some writing done. The drive up was easy, but the farther I got from town, the more I noticed how alone I really was. The last 20 miles were on a narrow, cracked road surrounded by dense trees, no houses in sight. When I finally reached the cabin, I felt relieved. It was old but sturdy, a single-story place with dark wooden walls and a wraparound porch. There was a well out back, a shed nearby, and a pile of firewood stacked neatly against the side. Inside, it smelled like old wood and dust. The furniture was basic: a couch, a small table, a few chairs, a bed in the one bedroom, a wood-burning stove in the corner, a single bathroom with an old clawfoot tub. No TV, no Wi-Fi, just a small radio and a stack of books left behind. The first day passed without much happening. I settled in, explored a bit, walked around the property. The forest was thick, the trees towering and close together. The quiet was almost too much at times, the kind of silence that presses against your ears. But I liked it. That night, I fell asleep early, the sound of the wind in the trees lulling me into a deep sleep. The second day, I woke up feeling uneasy. Couldn't place why. Something about the air felt different, heavier. I shook it off and went about my day, chopping some firewood, making simple meals, sitting outside with a book. But as the day went on, that feeling didn't go away. In fact, it got worse. That night, I was woken up by a sound outside. It wasn't loud, just a faint rustling, like someone walking through the underbrush. I sat up, listening. The sound came again, this time from the other side of the cabin. A slow, deliberate movement. I told myself it was an animal, a deer maybe, but I didn't quite believe it. I stayed in bed, listening, heart pounding. Eventually, the sound stopped, and I forced myself to sleep. The next morning, I found footprints near the porch. Human footprints. They weren't mine. The dirt was disturbed in several places, like someone had been walking in circles around the cabin. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe a hiker had gotten lost, passed through during the night. But why wouldn't they have knocked? Why wouldn't they have made themselves known? I spent the day on edge, checking the windows every so often, feeling watched. As the sun started to go down, I made sure the doors were locked, the windows shut tight. I kept the axe inside with me. That night, the sounds came back. This time, it wasn't just footsteps. I heard tapping on the windows, light, deliberate, first at the front, then at the back. I stayed completely still, barely breathing. The tapping stopped, but then came a low creak on the porch, like weight shifting on old wood. I didn't move, then silence. Hours passed before I finally dozed off, exhaustion overtaking fear. In the morning, more footprints. This time, they led from the woods to the porch, stopping just beneath the windows. I had the overwhelming urge to leave, to get in my car and drive back to town. But I didn't. I told myself I was being paranoid, that whoever it was had probably moved on. That night, I sat up with the axe beside me. I didn't even try to sleep. Around midnight, the noises started again. Footsteps, slow and deliberate. Then the tapping. I gripped the axe so tightly my hands ached. Then the doorknob rattled. I stood up, heart hammering. The rattling stopped. A long pause, then a whisper. No words, just a faint, breathy sound. I don't remember falling asleep, but I woke up at dawn, still gripping the axe. The door was still locked. Everything was exactly as I'd left it, except for one thing. There were deep scratches on the wooden porch, right in front of the door. Long, jagged marks like something or someone had dragged their nails across it. I left that morning. I didn't pack. I didn't clean up. I just grabbed my keys, got in my car, and drove until I saw other people again. I never found out who was out there. I don't want to, but I know this. I wasn't alone. And whoever it was, they weren't trying to break in. They were trying to make me come outside.